I was in the hospital for about 10 days, suffering from a kidney infection. My mother visited me, but the rest of the family was too busy, so I was pretty lonely and in pain. I used to keep in touch with my friends and family by mobile phone. Hospitals over the last 10 years allow the use of mobile phones. There was a young male student doctor who was chatty and friendly to all the patients. I can't remember his name, so I'm going to call him Edward. While attending the ward, Edward used to chat with me. He was very intelligent and a nice and decent chap. He gave me a get-well-soon card to cheer me up. The other female patients teased Edward and said that he should ask me out. I made it very clear to Edward that I did not fancy him at all. I told him he was like a brother to me. Edward laughed at what the ladies had said. He assured me that he didn't fancy me either, and said that a patient-doctor relationship was unethical anyway. After 10 days, I felt better. The doctors discharged me. I said my goodbyes to the other patients and to Edward and wished him well in his studies and career. I called a taxi to take me home. I had put my mobile phone on silent. When I reached home, I checked my phone and saw that I had 8 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. I was puzzled, but didn't think too much of it. I thought I'd ring the number the next day. I had a shower and went to bed. The next morning, I checked my phone. I realized I'd forgotten to turn the ringer back on and saw that I had another 10 missed calls. I called the number and a man answered the phone. To my surprise, it was Edward. I was a bit annoyed and asked Edward how he got my number. He told me that I had given it to him. I told him that I hadn't. He insisted so much that I had. I even began to doubt myself. In the hospital, I was in a lot of pain and doped up with morphine most of the time. Anyway, Edward and I chatted on the phone. He called me a few days later while I was recuperating at home. Edward would call me every few days. One day, I told Edward that I couldn't talk as I was still not well, but needed to go food shopping before the shops closed. Edward offered to shop for me and bring the food to my place. I politely declined. After that, Edward started calling me every day. I often didn't take his calls. He texted me, saying that he needed to talk as his mother was ill. I answered his next call. He told me that he had just said that because he wanted to talk to me. He said that he knew I had a hospital appointment in a few days, and that he would meet me there. He told me that he had a new mobile phone for me and would put me on his family plan. I asked him how he knew that I had an appointment. He told me that he'd accessed my medical records. I did not attend the hospital appointment as I didn't want to see Edward. I told Edward that I didn't want any more contact with him and to leave me alone. Edward told me that he loved me and wanted to marry me. Edward kept on calling and calling me. I did not take his calls. In one day, I'd have 40 missed calls and 60 text messages from him. He even called me in the middle of the night. I was creeped out and beginning to get scared. One day, I had a call from an unknown number. It was Edward. Edward kept changing his number so that I'd pick up. I was really scared by now. I told the police, but they said there was nothing they could do as he was not threatening me, etc. And Edward kept changing his number using pay-as-you-go phone chips, so it was hard to prove that it was actually him phoning me. I felt that Edward could get nasty and dangerous. I was particularly scared as my mom pointed out to me that he could find out where I lived by checking my medical records. I asked a good male friend of mine to answer Edward's phone call and pretend he was my new boyfriend. Well, that didn't work. Edward didn't believe that I had a boyfriend. I was at my wit's end. I wasn't sleeping or eating, and I was terrified. I even had friends over to stay with me. I made sure that I was never alone. One morning I woke up, and instead of fear, I was angry. How dare that stupid little coward bully me and totally take over and ruin my life? I telephoned Edward. I was very firm and assertive. I told him that if he ever contacted me again, I would report him to the dean of his university. I would send the dean all the text messages that he'd written to me. I told him that his career as a doctor would be over. From that day, Edward never contacted me again. I just wish I'd thought of it sooner. But I was so relieved as I could lead a normal life again. So back in November 2020, I was in and out of the hospital with testicular torsion 8 times altogether. On my last visit to one of the hospitals, I called a taxi to go home, but it would take about 30 minutes to get to me because it was a Saturday in the city. Since there was going to be a bit of a wait, I decided to sit down in a garden area just in front of the hospital. It was 3 a.m., about 0 degrees Celsius, and I had been awake for 36 hours at that point. My taxi was on its way, and I just sat cross-legged on the bench, headphones on, and nicotine keeping me alive. Everything was fine until, after 10 minutes, I noticed a guy very clearly walking directly towards me. He was stumbling a little bit, so I just assumed he was drunk. As he got level with me, he stopped right in front of me and said something that I didn't hear. I looked up and said, "What?" "Sorry, I had music on," as I pulled off my headphones, and he looked me dead in the eye and just said, "I could fucking batter you right now." Of everything I was expecting him to say, that wasn't on the list. Caught off guard, I tried to disarm him with humor by saying, "I don't doubt it," which did work, thank God, because he would have absolutely pummeled me into the ground. Every time I said that or something similar, he'd just say, "I could batter you. I want to deck you right here, right now, and I could take you in a fight," just to recall a few of them. After his anger had toned down, he sat on the bench next to me and started generally drunk rambling about his family and friends, and very specifically, his best friend's girlfriend that he was having an affair with. Then he pointed out my shoes, saying, "Those are nice, mate. Can I have them?" Obviously, I said no firmly, but not aggressively. Then thanked him and told him about the fact that I got them on sale. He said, "Can I touch them?" which was immediately a big red flag. I politely declined, but he started rubbing my shoe anyway. I was still sitting cross-legged on the bench. Then, in one swift movement, he grabbed my ankle, pulled my entire leg up to his face, and put the entire toe of my size 11 Converses in his mouth. At that point, while sitting in stunned silence, I started desperately looking around and saw the hospital police walking over. The officer asked if we were there together. The guy said yes, I said no. The officer then asked if he was a patient. I said yes, he said no. I told the officer I was just waiting for my taxi, and the guy rambled something I couldn't really make out to the officer, who suggested he move along. The guy stood up, gave me a handshake, and walked off into the night. The officer obviously asked if I was okay, and I told him what happened. He was just as confused as I was. After that, my taxi was due in 5 minutes, so I went and stood on the opposite side of the hospital where the taxi rank was. I asked some friends, who are familiar with a lot of drugs, what he could have been on, and they unanimously said meth. They also said the shoe thing was probably just a fetish. I'm a female in my mid-20s, and I work at my local hospital. This happened last week after I finished my shift in the evening. It was still light outside, so I decided to walk the 20 minutes home. Whenever I'm walking, I tend to listen to music on my iPod and just zone out. Not the safest idea, I know, but most of us do it. A few minutes into my walk, I had to cross a bridge over the motorway. As you walk up the slope to the bridge, there's a small wooded area on either side. I could feel something or someone around me, so I casually stopped my music and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, and I thought maybe I was being overly sensitive. I kept the music off, just in case, and continued walking. A few seconds later, I heard rustling behind me and turned around, startled. Again, nothing was there. At this point, my heart was racing, but I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I reached the top of the bridge, where I was out in the open and could see all around me, so I felt a lot better. 10 minutes later, as I neared home, I was laughing at myself for being so silly and paranoid. I was as relaxed as I could be, with my music back on, just enjoying winding down from work. I had just reached the top of the park opposite my road, and was feeling perked up since I was nearly home. I looked behind me. Not because I heard or sensed anything, but I'm very thankful I did, and saw a guy about 3 feet behind me. He was that close. The guy was tall, skinny, and had greasy black hair hanging around his face. He was dressed all in black. The creepiest part was that he looked dead behind the eyes. He was staring directly at me, and there was nothing there, just blankness. I turned back around and started walking quickly down the park, hoping I was just being silly. I contemplated rummaging in my bag for my phone to call the police, but didn't want to slow myself down. At that point, I still wondered if I was misreading the situation. The creeper continued following me, and although he wasn't as close as 3 feet anymore, he had still significantly kept up his speed. Every time I looked behind me, he was staring directly at me, still emotionless and completely dead behind the eyes. I contemplated heading somewhere else to try and lose him, but I was terrified and just wanted to get to the safety of my house. As my house came into view, I decided to run for it, which I should have done sooner evidently. When I looked behind me, I noticed the creeper wasn't running after me, but was still walking fast, staring at me. I got to my door and rummaged through my bag for my keys, fully aware that at any moment the creeper could catch up. I grabbed them, hurriedly let myself into the house when he was 15 feet away, and slammed and locked the door behind me. I then ran upstairs. The front door has glass panels, and our living room area has big glass doors facing the back garden. I didn't want him to be able to see me. I was shaking as I edged up the stairs and looked out of the stairway window. He was nowhere to be seen. I went upstairs and looked out of the bedroom window to get a better view of the front garden, and I couldn't see him. I thought he'd gone. With my heart still racing, I got my phone out of my bag and headed downstairs to call the non-emergency number. As I walked into my living room, his face was pressed up against the glass, peering into my house, and we made eye contact. Dead eyes again. I let out quite the scream and ran back upstairs. I called the emergency number. As I waited for the police, the creeper took a seat in my garden, cross-legged, just staring at the house. The police arrived within 10 minutes and picked him up. He went without any struggle. The policewoman who came told me he had said to them, "I was just waiting for her." It turns out the creeper is an inpatient in the psychiatric ward of my hospital. From what I've found out since, he developed a bit of a fascination with me from seeing me around the hospital while I was doing my job. Some people I know in the psychiatry unit told me he'd been mentioning his girlfriend recently, and they all thought it was another patient. They now think he was talking about me. He's been moved to another hospital now, somewhere where he can recover, and I won't be afraid to go to work. I'm hoping he doesn't have the freedom to just leave as he pleases if he plans on creeping on hospital staff. I do hope he gets better, but I'm finding it hard to have warm wishes for him when he terrified me as much as he did. I will definitely be catching the bus from now on. A while ago, I got a job at a small hospital just outside of town. I was excited because it was the first job I'd been offered since completing my schooling. It was just casual work, but I was ecstatic at the opportunity to work there. The pay was great, and it was the place where I completed my practicum. Most of the time, I worked 12-hour shifts, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., but occasionally, I'd be given the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shifts. I didn't care much for those. I was used to working late from my previous job, but now I had to drive a lot further to get home, and the late shifts were usually very slow. Another reason I didn't like them was because there weren't many people on staff, and I would get lonely. Usually there were 4 nurses, 1 admin, me, and the emergency doctor. That was it. Being in a small hospital like this one, you see some pretty strange things come in. Some people can't make it into the city, so we've had the emergency STARS helicopter drop in now and then. I've seen terrible things, like whole families dying from accidents on the curved country roads. I've even had people bring in animals in desperation because there was no vet nearby that was open. One particular night, around 10 p.m., I was sitting and talking with one of the RNs about a patient's chart, but mostly just wasting time until I could go home at 11 p.m. The hospital was quiet, and I'd only checked around 6 people into the emergency room at that point. I remember I was eating my yogurt when I heard a strange noise coming from the main doors. I saw a man walking toward us. He looked mostly normal, but he had a long coat on, which was strange as it was the middle of summer. Even though it was dark outside, it was still relatively warm. The RN next to me sighed and got up to go to the bathroom, leaving me to tend to our new arrival. As the man drew closer, the strange sound got louder, and something caught the light. He was dragging something behind him that I couldn't quite make out, but I assumed it was metal by the noise it was making. It sent a shiver up my spine. He stopped at the desk, and I could see that his eyes were wide, his pupils dilated. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a while. I'd seen this look many times and immediately associated it with someone who was high on something. He leaned on the desk, ran his fingers through his hair, pulling at it and grinding his teeth. When people like this come in, they're usually looking for drugs. Most of the time, they'll complain of a migraine or fibromyalgia, anything we can't easily disprove. I processed him as usual and noticed he was getting more and more irritable as time passed. When I finished and pointed him toward the waiting area, he asked how long it would be. Knowing that the on-call doctor had gone on a quick break, I estimated about half an hour. That's when his entire demeanor changed. Anger was obvious on his face as he stormed over to the waiting area, which is a room between the emergency room and the front desk area with doors. As he walked away, I caught a glimpse of what he was dragging, and I quickly realized it was an axe. I panicked and almost called the code over the paging system, but I didn't want him to realize what I was doing. I promptly called the police on my cell phone and ran down the hall to signal to the nurses that we had a serious issue. The police would have to come from 2 towns over, which takes, on average, 20 minutes. Of course, since we were all small women, we didn't want to go near him. He was tall and muscular. Even if we combined our efforts, we probably wouldn't stand a chance. I calmly walked back to the front desk and paged the doctor, asking him to call me. I waited and waited but never got a response. I watched the man getting more agitated. Soon, he started yelling and asking for help. I hid from him, not wanting him to come back to me. We devised a plan to lock him in the waiting area. The glass was reinforced and the doors were heavy, so it should hold him in there until the police arrived. The plan went off without a hitch until the man realized what we'd done. He started screaming and throwing chairs around the room. Fortunately, he was alone, so we didn't have to worry about him hurting anyone. Then he started using his axe on the door and the glass to the front desk area where we were all standing and watching. I've never been so terrified in my life. What made it even worse was the fact that he was making some progress on the door. At that moment, the emergency doctor walked in through the front door of the hospital, sipping a drink from the convenience store across the road. He saw us all huddled behind the desk and quickly took charge of the situation. After getting all the necessary information, he disappeared toward the back entrance of the emergency room, the way ambulances bring patients in. He unlocked the door of the waiting room and tackled the man to the floor when he wasn't looking, then proceeded to tie him up with cable ties. He sat on his back until the cops arrived. I was so thankful to have that young, physically fit doctor with us on that night. I bought him coffee every time our schedules crossed as a thank you, but I don't think it will ever be enough. As this was the second incident that happened to me while working a late shift, I decided never to work late shifts again. I'm now a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 worker. It's much safer that way.